Let's get started. Roland, are you ready?
1 minute past 7. Is that okay, Roland?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the Space Science webinar series hosted by the Center for Space Science, NYU Abu Dhabi, and the UAE Space Agency. So today we have an important milestone. Today is our 10th webinar. And all our webinars are now on YouTube. You can just go to YouTube and type Center for Space Science, and you'll see all the videos there, including the symposium that we had. Our today's speaker is Dr. Roland Young from UAE University in Al Ain. He is a member of the Department of Physics as well as NSSTC, which is the National Space Science and Technology Center. He got his PhD from Oxford. He did a postdoc there and then moved to Paris, was there for several years in Sorbonne, and then moved here to Al Ain. And he is leading the planetary science group at UAE University. So welcome, Roland. It's all yours.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for inviting me. And so as Dimitra said, I am leading a planetary science group, which is a small group within this National Space Science and Technology Center at UAE University. And the research focus of the NSSTC is on several things, but my interest in planetary science, and there's also Earth observation and various other research efforts that are beginning related to various aspects of space science. So we have a small group which is expanding, and we're involving students and junior researchers, and we have a particular interest in Mars for the foreseeable future, in linking to the national interest at the moment in the UAE with the Emirates Mars Mission. And so today, what I'm going to talk about is the research work that I am doing to explore the atmosphere of Mars using data from two spacecraft. One current spacecraft and one future spacecraft, and I'm going to talk about some of the methods that I use to do that, and some of the things that we can find out by using this by using these platforms, which are really exciting things to be part of. To be part of a planetary mission is a very exciting thing to do. So I really like being part of both of these. So where are we? So let's start in the big picture. This is the solar system, and not to scale, of course, but the size of the planets and the sun are to scale. So we have the sun on the left, the inner planets on the next out, including Earth with its moon, and then the giant planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, and then Pluto, which is a planet or not a planet, depending on your point of view and how old you are. But Mars, this fourth planet from the sun, is the planet that we're interested in today. So exploring the planets is a monumental effort. It takes many thousands of people all over the world involved with exploring the planets. These are the active missions in the solar system at the current time, as of September 2020. So all the ones in the diagram at the top are active spacecraft. The names are all in green. And then at the bottom, there is a list of events coming up in the next 3 or 4 years. So you can see this is the whole of the solar system, the inner solar system here, various spacecraft around the moon, and several spacecraft exploring Mars. So the two that I'm going to talk about today are both Mars missions. One of them has arrived and has been there for a couple of years. And the other one, the Hope probe from the UAE, is on the way. This is the general outline of the talk. I'm going to talk briefly about Mars itself. My interest in Mars is in its atmosphere. So I will talk mainly about that, its atmosphere and climate. I will then talk about the tools that we use to study the atmosphere, or the ones that I use, which is a combination of numerical climate models and a technique called data assimilation that I will talk about. Then I'm going to talk about the two spacecraft that I'm been involved with, or the data that I'm using, spacecraft data from the spacecraft, the ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter and the Emirates Mars Mission. And then I'll close with a few open questions that we might be able to address in the near future about the atmosphere of Mars using these techniques and these platforms. So this is Mars, fourth rock from the sun. As you can see, it is a predominantly red planet. It has two polar caps and a very cratered surface, but a big variety of environments. But predominantly, it's a cold and very dry desert world. In terms of size, it's about half the size of the Earth in terms of diameter, and about 50% farther from the sun, so it gets less light than we do here on Earth. But it has some similarities. In particular, its rotation speed is about the same as the Earth. Its day is just over half an hour longer than the Earth's day. And the tilt of its axis, which determines the seasonal cycle, is about the same as the Earth. As it's farther from the sun, it orbits in a longer time, and it takes about double the time to orbit the sun. But in some respects, it's quite extreme, more extreme than the Earth. It has deep valleys and high mountains. The highest point on the planet is 26 kilometers above the surrounding plains, compared with the Earth, where it's only 9 kilometers. And it has two tiny moons, Phobos and Deimos. The atmosphere is primarily composed of carbon dioxide. And as I mentioned, it has two polar caps. You can see these here on the right. And these polar caps are a combination of carbon dioxide ice, which actually condenses from the bulk atmosphere itself, and water. And these are both permanent and seasonal phenomena. The surface pressure is very low. It's 1% of the Earth's surface pressure. You think of it as the pressure you would get if you went up in the Earth's atmosphere about 20 kilometers. You'd get to about this pressure. And this means that there is a very strong daily cycle between the day and the night. And as I mentioned, it has a similar axial tilt, but it also has an orbit that is less circular than the Earth's. And these two combine to make a strong seasonal cycle, which I will talk about in a couple of slides. Finally, the atmosphere is very strongly driven by dust. Dust is lifted from the surface and it interacts with light going in and coming in and going out, both visible light and infrared. And this has a critical effect on the climate and the weather. And I will talk later on about a dust storm, global dust storm, which occur periodically, and what we've been studying with relation to that. So a little bit of atmospheric science. This plot on the left summarizes the circulation, the annual mean climate, as it were. So the top plot shows the temperature, annual temperature. We have a hot, relatively warm equator near the ground, very cold upper atmosphere near the equator, and then cooling off towards the poles. This middle plot shows what's called the zonal wind. That's the west to east wind speed. Red means the wind speed is the wind is moving from west to east, and blue means it's moving from east to west. And the bottom plot shows what's called the meridional circulation, which, suppose you were to look kind of east or west, if you were to look at the whole atmosphere from the east or the west, this tells you how the atmosphere is moving in the plane of the kind of the plane between the north and the south poles, and from the surface up to space. And what tends to happen is that the planet is heated near the equator at the surface, and air rises near the equator, and it moves upwards, and then it moves outwards towards the poles. And this drives the circulation. If you look at the camera, it kind of looks like this, with rising air near the equator and falling air near the poles. And on average, if you study the equations, this leads to these two jet streams, one near the one in the middle latitudes of the northern hemisphere and one in the middle latitudes of the southern hemisphere. This is a map of the topography, or the surface elevation, and it is quite a lot more extreme than the Earth's topography. Here, the red and yellow colors are high, and the blue and green colors are low. So in the southern hemisphere is about 8 kilometers higher than the northern hemisphere, and it's much more cratered, and the northern hemisphere is much smoother. We have here 4 mountains. These are the tallest. One of them is the tallest mountain in the solar system, Olympus Mons, and these are all ancient volcanoes. And we also have the Valles Marineris, just to the east, which is an extremely large and very long canyon. As I mentioned, the planet orbits around the sun, as the Earth does. But it has an orbit that is a bit more elliptical than the Earth's, and this means that both the axial tilt of the planet and the position in the orbit combine together to determine the climate and the season. So I want to point out 2 points in the orbit. Here, this blue line shows the Earth's orbit around the sun, and the red line shows Mars's orbit around the sun, and you can see that it is much closer to the sun at this point than it is at this point. So this means we have a kind of, the seasons are asymmetric in the sense that the summer in one hemisphere is significantly warmer than the summer in the other hemisphere. And what this means for Mars is that in the time of year that on Earth we would think of as a kind of June, July, the Martian southern hemisphere is extremely cold, but the northern hemisphere is reasonably mild. And then the opposite end of the year, the kind of December, November time, the southern hemisphere is reasonably warm and the northern hemisphere is reasonably cold. So when the planet is farther away from the sun, the seasons are more extreme. And this actually leads to 2 different parts of the year. Each one is approximately half a year long, called the clear season and the dusty season. And during the dusty season, a lot of dust is lifted off the surface of the planet, and it moved around by the weather. And so this summarizes that cycle. What this plot shows here is a quantity called solar longitude, which is you can think of as the time of year. So the Mars year starts in what we would think starts in the spring solstice, the spring equinox. So we would think of it as kind of March time, and then going through the summertime here, northern summer, and then northern winter in this part of the year. So in the second half of the year, we get dust lifted off the surface, and this causes a seasonal dust cycle that is more active during the second part of the year, because the planet is that much closer to the sun and there's that much more energy put into the system. And one consequence of this is that during some years we have quite extreme dust storms. This shows an animation created, I forget which spacecraft this is. This is from the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, and this shows 2 animations, one taken in May 2018 and the other taken in July 2018. And you can see there's a very clear difference between the 2. In May 2018, we can see the surface, but by July 2018, the surface is almost completely obscured by dust. And this is what's called a global dust storm, where dust is lifted, a huge amount of dust is lifted off the surface, and it kind of triggers this runaway behavior that ends up with the whole of the planet being covered and obscured by dust. And these are irregular, they're very hard to predict. In fact, there are no models that can predict when they will occur as of yet. And in fact, one of the things that we're studying at NSSCC, a colleague of mine, Dr. Klaus Gebhardt, is working on numerical modeling of dust storms, studying how they form and how they develop over time. So this is a very wide open question in Martian atmospheric science, because it's as you can see, just by visual inspection of the planet, it is clearly a very important physical process. So these occur probably once every 3 to 4 Mars years, so kind of every 6 to 7 Earth years. So this summarizes the spacecraft currently exploring Mars. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I don't think any of these have deactivated since I made this slide. No, I don't think so. So there are several from the United States. A couple of landers are active at the present time. One rover, Curiosity, and one lander, Insight, studying the internal structure. And then there are several orbiters sent by the United States, by Europe, and by India. And these are studying the climate, looking for rare gases, and studying the upper atmosphere and the space environment around the planet itself. The oldest of these, Mars Odyssey, has been there almost 20 years and is still sending back good data that we can make use of. Now, of course, at the moment, everyone is excited about the Emirates Mars mission. It's not the only spacecraft on the way to Mars at the moment. There are 3. Alongside Hope, there is a rover that's been sent by NASA from the USA called Perseverance. And this is the first stage in a multi-spacecraft effort that should take place over the next decade or so to return samples from the surface of Mars, geological samples from the surface of Mars to Earth. And this will do, the way it will do this spacecraft this rover has essentially a collection of test tubes that it will put samples into, and then it will keep those samples until the next spacecraft in the series, whenever that occurs, is able to come and collect them from this rover. This rover will have a demonstration. Essentially, it's a helicopter. It's a very small drone, and it's going to demonstrate the use of drone technology on Mars, something that could be a big thing in the next decade or a couple of decades for space exploration. Finally, we have a spacecraft from China, Tianwen-1. China is very ambitious in this is their first mission to attempt to land on Mars. They have sent one spacecraft to Mars before, whose target was one of the Martian moons, but it failed to leave Earth orbit. And so this is the first mission they're sending to the surface of Mars, and they are sending an orbiter, a lander, and a rover all at the same time. It took the USA many decades to do this in several stages, so we're very excited to see how successful that will be. Okay, so the techniques that I use to try and understand the atmosphere of Mars, there are 2 I'm going to talk about, and one of these you can think of as a virtual laboratory, and this is essentially a simulated atmosphere that we build on a computer. So imagine a sphere, and the atmosphere is a kind of shell of gas around the sphere. So we can split up this shell of gas into boxes, into 3-dimensional boxes, and we split it up in. Typically, you would split it into longitudes and latitudes, and then you split up think of the surface, and then the column of air above the surface, and you split up each of these horizontal domains into a column of boxes, each containing a certain amount of air. Now, depending on what you're simulating, there might be water below. For Mars, there isn't any water below. We just have a column of air. The details there are many details on exactly how to do this and many methods. But in the end, what we have is a set of boxes that each of which describes a small amount of air, and then we write a computer simulation that describes how that air interacts with surrounding particles, how the air moves, the temperature of the areas, what the composition is, and so on. Okay, I can see there's a chat, but I'm going to leave that for the moment, unless people want me to respond to questions as I go. I'm happy to do that.
No, I don't think you need to do that.
I think we'll have Q&A.
I'll leave it. We'll leave it. We'll look at them. I'll look at them at the end. Okay. Okay. So in each of these boxes, we solved some equations. We solved equations that describe the fluid flow, the flow of the air. We solve equations that describe physical processes that happen on scales smaller than the grid box. So for example, on Earth, you might have a grid box that was 100 kilometers across, but it contains many clouds. Clouds are smaller, but they have a strong effect on the climate and on the weather on the larger scale. And so you need to account for those physical processes on the scale of your grid. And then comprehensive climate models, ones that would be used for the Earth. They have sophisticated representations of chemistry, atmospheric chemistry, the oceans and waves and other things like that, ice sheets and so on. Typically, we run these on a large cluster or a supercomputer. And one of the really cool things about planets is you get to kind of play around with what processes are important on the different planets when you're designing this type of tool. So on Mars, we have the dust is particularly important. If you're simulating the atmosphere of Venus, then there are clouds made of sulfuric acid that you have to take into account. If you are simulating the atmosphere of Saturn, then you need to account for the shadow that's thrown by the Saturn's rings onto its atmosphere, and so on. There are many different examples, and these are several different examples of different climate simulations that are used for various purposes, both on Earth and for Mars. So the climate model that we use, that I'm using, is called the LMD Mars Global Climate Model. LMD stands for the Laboratoire de Météorologie Dynamique, which is a research institute in Paris. And they have, over 20 years or so, they have built one of the world's leading climate models for Earth, and they have applied it to many other planets. This model contributes to the International Panel on Climate Change studies, and is used for weather forecast, climate forecasting. But people also use it to study the other planets. And so for Mars, this solves these equations of fluid flow and many representations of many physical processes, such as the interaction of light between light and the air molecules, the seasonal cycles, the daily cycles, so-called diurnal cycles, the transport of dust, the effects of the surface height, the water cycle and the ice caps, clouds, condensation, and a whole load of other things that are listed there on the left. And this doesn't mean it's a complete model, of course. There are many processes that we do not yet understand fully. And for Mars, we are limited mainly by the observations that we have. There are many things that we cannot observe. For example, it's pretty much impossible to measure the wind speed on Mars. It has been done from some of the landers, but it's very hard to do systematically. So we're building a climate model without much information, or at least observational information about that. However, there is a lot of information that it can be, these models can be tested against, and this has been done. This has been done since it's been done using data that have been generated since the 1970s. The first lander data from Viking, in particular, has a very high quality record of the surface pressure over the course of several years that is used for doing this, along with many other orbiting spacecraft since then. So the second technique is what's called data assimilation. And this is a method that we can use to combine observations of a phenomenon with other sources of information about it. So the idea is, by doing this, that you can think of having two sources of information about some unknown phenomenon that you're trying to observe. So you can have an observation of something, and you can have a prediction about that same quantity. And data assimilation tells you how to combine those two sources of information together in a statistically rigorous way. And the point of doing this is that both of these, an observation always has an uncertainty associated with it, as does a prediction. But the idea is that by combining the two, the uncertainty in the combined product, which we call the analysis, is smaller. And this can be proved mathematically. And this is the principle that we base this technique on. So this can be used this is used in many areas, but it's used a lot in atmospheric science and is in fact one of the critical components of weather forecasting. So here on the right, I'm showing an example of this in action. So this is a rotating tank experiment. It's a laboratory experiment that replicates some of the major aspects of a planetary atmosphere. I don't have time to go into detail about the specific experiment at the moment, but one can make measurements, for example, of the speed of the fluid. This is an example of such a measurement, and you can see here that we have observations of the speed of the fluid at various points. So one of the first kind of powerful thing that data assimilation can do is that it can use a model to fill in all the gaps between those observations, because the model needs to be internally consistent, and over time the model and the observations will converge towards each other. So this is the blue shows this so-called analysis velocity field, and the red shows these observations, and the analysis essentially fills in those gaps. So the second powerful aspect of this technique is that we can use it to recover quantities that are not observed at all. So I mentioned the wind speed on Mars. Wind is not observed on Mars almost. So it's very difficult to observe on Mars, but we can observe other quantities, and we understand the physical relationships between different quantities like pressure and temperature and wind speed and certain conditions. And so what the model can do is that it can take observations of velocity and it can assimilate them and use them to update other quantities that are not observed, like temperature. So in this case, we have a lab experiment where we can measure the fluid velocity, and we can use this technique to recover what the temperature of the fluid is, based on the internal consistency of the model itself. So these two things make this technique quite powerful. And so we can apply it to Mars by running simulations of the Martian climate using our model. And then we combine them with observations. In this case, this illustrates some observations from Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. And these two are then combined using this technique to produce this analysis, which also has an uncertainty associated with it. And then from that point, that gives you a starting point for the next set of forecasts. And you run a forecast forward in time to get a new series of forecasts. And then you combine that forecast with the observations that are newly available at that new time. So the way you would do this is you have a long observational data set. You start a forecast at the start, and then you combine you assimilate the observations in small chunks as you move through the data set to the end. So in practice for Mars, we assimilate atmospheric temperatures. These are columns taken by spacecraft. You can see this up here on the right. Each of these dots represents a column of atmospheric temperatures that this spacecraft has measured. And there are other data sets, but temperature is by far the largest and most important data set that one can assimilate in this context. And so that is what we're doing at the moment. And we can retrieve other quantities such as wind, surface pressure, and the amount of dust based on how temperature and these quantities interact with each other. So for Mars, we use this technique for various reasons, and there are kind of 5 main reasons why this is an important technique to use. So the first is that you might have a model that omits physical processes, or that is wrong in some sense. And we know that, for example, on Mars, we don't really understand the distribution of dust in the vertical direction. It's very hard to measure. So by using assimilation, you can kind of think of assimilating a temperature column, and what the model should do is it should adjust the dust distribution so it becomes consistent with that temperature distribution. And so this allows us to kind of adjust for cases where the model doesn't have the correct physical processes included in it, because we don't understand them well enough. We can also use it to tune the model to measure, in a sense, physical parameters that are unknown or that are not possible to measure with our current technology. And even suppose you have a model that is perfect, in the sense that it perfectly describes the system, we still need this because in some cases, the atmospheric flow is chaotic. And chaotic, I mean, in the mathematical sense, that if you start two simulations from very similar initial states, over a certain amount of time, they will diverge exponentially fast. Some processes are not resolved by the model grid. I mentioned that earlier. In particular, some processes involved with related to dust, this applies to. And then there are, again, some boundary conditions that we cannot measure or that have not been measured yet. And we can use data assimilation to get a handle on, to get a handle on what those boundary conditions might be. And actually, in principle, one could use this method to measure the boundary conditions without actually observing them directly. So there are several things that we can do with this. So I've been working with so far I've been working with one spacecraft in this effort to use data assimilation to understand some aspects of the Martian atmosphere. So the first of these is the ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter. And the main goal of this spacecraft, this arrived in Mars, it got to its final orbit in April 2018, so it's been there for 2 years or so. And its main goal is to search for very rarefied gases. In particular, it was designed to look for methane, because methane, if it exists, is a possible biosignature. Depending on what other molecules are found with methane, may indicate a biological origin. So you can see here, down here on the left, some of these potential photochemical pathways that might occur if in the Martian atmosphere, and what other quantities you might expect to find. For example, here's you can see methane is here. This would be a geological source of methane, but then other processes you would expect to find. If you have biological activity, you might expect to find methane combined with some of these other species. So it has several instruments to do this, and these are infrared instruments that are used primarily to look through the atmosphere at the sun, and that is an observation that gives you very precise electromagnetic spectrum, and from that you can retrieve the abundance of different chemicals as a function of position over the surface and height above the ground. So in terms of climate studies, there is an instrument that is useful for measuring the climate, and this is the instrument that I've used the data from. And this is the instrument is called ACS-TIRVIM. So ACS stands for the Atmospheric Chemistry Suite. It is an infrared instrument on board the ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter. And TIRVIM means a thermal infrared channel, which is a long wavelength, long infrared wavelength channel. And it is, many spacecraft have one of the instruments, and they use it to measure properties of the atmosphere itself. So you can do a lot of things with this. In the bottom left, this is just a cartoon showing the difference between looking at an object in visible light and in thermal infrared light. In this case, this bag made of whatever bags are made of, some kind of plastic, is opaque if you look at it in visible light, but in thermal infrared light it is transparent. You can see the hand. So this is true for atmospheres as well. And if you're someone who knows how to interpret this type of data, you can actually work out a lot of information from a plot like this. And this shows the amount of light reaching the detector as a function of wave number or wavelength. Long wave is the longest waves are over here on the left, and the shortest waves are here on the right. And you can pick out a lot of information from this. For example, this part of the spectrum will tell you something about the surface temperature. This strong absorption feature here is due to carbon dioxide absorbing light in the atmosphere. It tells you about that. This very broad feature here between these, in this region of the spectrum will tell you something about how much dust there is in the atmosphere. And then there are other things that, if you're an expert, you'll be able to pick out. I'm not an expert on this particular method, but just just want to give you an impression of what you can get from this type of data set. So you can work out things like what the temperature is at up higher up in the atmosphere, and even where you can see places where the atmospheric temperature is higher than the surface temperature. So this, applying various mathematical techniques to this will give you a column of temperatures and abundances. And we can then use that and we can assimilate that into our models and use that to understand what the climate is doing. So I want to quickly show a few results, and this shows what we did is we're studying the global dust storm that I mentioned earlier on between May and July 2018. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to understand what effect this had on the general circulation, in particular perhaps on some quantities that we can't observe directly. And so the way we did this is we used these data, the atmospheric temperatures taken by this instrument. These were processed at LMD by Sandrine Gurley. And so we have a comparison of two experiments. One where we run the climate model without assimilating any observations. We just run the climate model as appropriate for that time of year, for the climate at that time of year. And then second, we have a simulation that assimilates observations into the model, and the climate will change accordingly. So a couple of things I want to show. So this shows what's called the diurnal and semidiurnal tide. And this is a representation of, this shows the local time. So this is midnight and noon and midnight again. So basically time of day against pressure on the y-axis. And this shows a region near the equator. So basically what this is showing you is it's showing you the daily cycle of temperature as a function of altitude and a function of time of day. And we see how this changes before and during the dust storm. So before the dust storm, this so-called quiescent period, there is an oscillation, which we can see here. You can see in the upper atmosphere here, where it's warmer here and cooler here, and warmer here and cooler here. This is called the semidiurnal tide. And this is an oscillation in temperature that occurs over a 12-hour period. So when we assimilate data into the model and look at what happens at the peak of the dust storm, what we find is that normally the semidiurnal tide only occurs in the upper atmosphere. It doesn't really affect what's happening in the lower atmosphere. But at the peak of the storm, we see that this tide is strongly affected by the dust. There's a lot more heating near the surface, and this drives an additional. This makes the semidiurnal tide stronger, much stronger near the surface, and we see that semidiurnal tide is active basically throughout the entire atmospheric column. Second thing that we can also look at is we can try and measure an unobserved quantity. So in particular, we're always interested in trying to measure the wind speeds and directions on Mars, because they're very hard to measure directly. So what a simulation can do is it can give us the wind field based on the observations that are assimilated. And so what I'm showing here is a quantity called the meridional mass stream function. And basically where this is brown, it means that the air is moving in a clockwise direction on average. And where it is blue, it's moving, or bluey-green, it's moving in an anti-clockwise direction. So this is before the storm. Up here on the y-axis is height above the surface, and then on the x-axis is the latitude. So we have the southern hemisphere, which is higher than the northern hemisphere. And what we basically see is this is the basic state of the Martian atmosphere at this time of year. We have air rises near the equator, and it has what's called an overturning cell. And this cell extends to about 45 degrees latitude. And then closer between that and the pole, there is another cell that goes in the opposite direction. So we assimilated data during the storm, and we found that at the peak of the storm, in fact, this is not This is a comparison between the free-running model at the same time as the peak of the storm was happening and the analysis, which included assimilating these observations. And so the difference we can see here is that the meridional circulation is strengthened. This is the circulation near the equator is what's called a Hadley cell. Air rises near the equator, moves outwards towards the pole, and then falls back towards the ground. And what we found is that this cell strengthens, and it becomes it grows to fill almost the entire hemisphere. Essentially, the poles, these indirect cells that are moving in the opposite direction, they basically disappear, or mostly disappear, during the global dust storm. And this will affect how, for example, quantities are transported through the atmosphere and how heat and momentum are moved around as well. So both of these are being slowly prepared for publication, and will be published hopefully in the next several months or so. So the next steps for this mission, we want to assimilate 2 spacecrafts data simultaneously throughout the previous the current year on Mars is Mars year 34, and we want to assimilate data. The current year is Mars year 35. So there is data throughout Mars year 34 from several spacecraft, and we want to assimilate data from 2 of these at the same time, because the data from ExoMars is we have 2 spacecraft that kind of complement each other. And we have a spacecraft called the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, which has a similar instrument on board it. This has very high resolution in the vertical. It can produce temperature profiles with high resolution vertically, 5 kilometers, I believe, of vertical resolution, which is pretty good. But it only observes the atmosphere at 2 different times of day. Imagine all that we knew about the Earth's atmosphere was from observing it at 3 p.m. and 3 a.m. Well, until very recently, this was the case for Mars. Many spacecraft, for a particular technical reason, observe the atmosphere at local time, 3 p.m. and 3 a.m. or 2 p.m. and 2 a.m. local time. And this is what this spacecraft does, but it does it with a very high vertical resolution, so it's a very good data set. Complementary to that is the ExoMars data set, which has lower vertical resolution, but one of the things about the ExoMars spacecraft is that it's able to cover all the different local times over a 55 sol period. 1 sol is essentially 1 day on Mars. So the combination of these 2 should allow us to better represent the Martian atmosphere in a more complete sense. So the future, in early 2021, the Emirates Mars Mission HOPE will arrive in Martian orbit. This launched in July 2020. I hope you all watched the launch. Very late, as I recall, at night, but it's very exciting to see. And this spacecraft will be operational in Mars orbit for at least 1 year, and not 1 Martian year, so at least until 2023. And it's there to study the atmosphere. Its goals are to characterize the state of the Martian lower atmosphere on a global scale, and to study the seasonal cycles, the diurnal cycles, and the geographic, how it changes with position on the planet. It's also studying the upper atmosphere, the structure of the upper atmosphere in the so-called exosphere. And then, uniquely for a single spacecraft, it's going to look at both of these at the same time and how they connect with each other. So I will talk on a couple of slides about why this is a particularly good platform for data assimilation. But first, just to tell you a bit more about the instruments. There will be 3 instruments. The first one of these is the one that I will use the most data from. This is called the Emirates Mars Infrared Spectrometer, or MES, and this is a infrared instrument. And it's similar to instruments that have gone before, similar in some sense to the ExoMars instrument that I was just talking about. And this will take measurements of dust, temperatures, surface temperature, dust opacity, so that's the concentration of dust down to the surface, and water vapor, water ice, all using the infrared instrument. Then we have the Emirates Exploration Imager, or EXI-XE. This will take high-resolution photographs of the surface, and it will also have particular filters that allow it to study some other aerosol quantities like ozone and water ice clouds. And then finally, the third instrument. This is not one that I really know how to make use of yet, but perhaps it will be possible eventually for me to make use of this too. This is the Emirates Mars Ultraviolet Spectrometer, or EMUS. This is an ultraviolet instrument that studies the atmosphere, the upper atmosphere, the oxygen and hydrogen coronae in the upper atmosphere from about 100 kilometers altitude upwards. So what makes HOPE special as a spacecraft is so I've mentioned it can observe the upper and lower atmospheres simultaneously, and that has not been possible before from a single spacecraft, I believe. But really, what will make it really interesting is the orbit that the spacecraft has. So if you look here on this diagram on the right, you'll see all these red lines show the orbits of the six orbiters that are currently in orbit around Mars at the present time. And what you'll notice about all of them is that they are all, they have a low orbit, and these are all polar orbits. So the spacecraft passes over the poles, and this means that the spacecraft's close to the ground. They get a high resolution view, but only of a small part of the planet. And typically they only observe 2 local times of day. Now, EMM is going to be in a high orbit, and you can see it here. This is to scale, so this is the size of Mars, and EMM here is on this brown orbit, and so at its lowest point it will be several radii of Mars away from the planet, and this means that the spacecraft will be able to see the whole of one side of the planet at a time and take complete images of the planet, and second, it will be able to watch the planet rotate around underneath it. And this means that it will be able to see all of the different local times over quite a short period, over about 10 days. This is much, much faster than has ever been possible before. The only other spacecraft that has been able to observe all local times has been the ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter, and it does so over quite a long period. I forget exactly what the period is now, but it's on the order of 50 or 60 days, I believe. And so both of these means that it will really be quite a different type of instrument viewing platform than any of the spacecraft that have come before. And so we're very excited about this for the purposes of data assimilation, because it means we can track complete weather patterns at once. We can assimilate a complete data sets over the whole planet, or at least over one hemisphere of the planet, and we can see all of the different local times, which is not possible. So this is just a more technical comparison of the orbits. So here we have 2 spacecraft, both in near polar orbits or polar orbits. Actually, I've written this wrong. This is not MCS. MCS is an instrument. The spacecraft is called Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, or MRO. And over one Martian day, you can see it covers quite a lot of the surface, but at very high resolution. Whereas in terms of the local times that it observes, it's a fixed local time. So here we have a plot showing local time on the x-axis, latitude on the y-axis. And basically, the spacecraft sees all the latitudes at one local time, but not at any of the other local times. So the Trace Gas Orbiter, by contrast, sees all local times, but over a long cycle, 55 sols, and it sees this at all latitudes up to plus or minus 75 degrees in latitude. So you get to see all local times eventually, but it does take quite a long time. So this is what EMM will do. The 2 images on the left illustrate the geometry of the observations. But what I really want to impress on you here is how much of the planet will be seen over a really quite a short period. And so what this animation is showing is it's showing each of the dots. The color of the dots represents the local time, and the x-axis is the longitude, the y-axis is the latitude. And this means that all of the longitudes and all of the latitudes will be observed at pretty much every local time over just 10 days. And this is much, much faster than has ever been possible before. So this type of data set is going to be very exciting, and we're really looking forward to seeing this and making use of it. And the idea is that we will assimilate as much of the data as we can into our numerical climate models. And we will start with thermal infrared observations, temperature profiles, surface temperature, and maps of aerosol abundances, first from the infrared instrument, and then later on from the imaging, the visible imager. So in the end, we intend to assimilate those dust optical depths, water and ice, column abundances, and ozone. This is quite challenging, and I don't believe that all of these have been assimilated at once at any point before. So this will be a really world-leading data set if it's possible to assimilate all of these. And in any case, it will have a very high quality observational data set with really great coverage that should allow us to study many aspects of the Martian climate. So just my last slide here before I open for questions. These are some of the open questions that we think we can tackle using data assimilation from EMM-Hope. So we were interested in this, in terms of the dust cycle, we're interested in the sources and sinks of dust and how fast dust is lifted off the ground. We're interested in prediction. Is it possible to predict dust storms? So as I mentioned, there are two Cloudscape Hard is working here in SSTC on dust modeling. And also we have a researcher, Ahmed Jalil, who is working with me on trying to understand the dust sources and sinks of dust and dust lifting from the surface using some older data assimilation data sets. So we can try and understand what we can learn about Mars weather and climate by observing complete weather patterns. We want to understand the ozone cycle, how ozone changes over days and seasons. We may be able to assimilate data from the upper atmosphere. This has definitely never been done before. As far as I know, this has never been done before by any Mars data assimilation effort. But there will be data at the same time as the temperature data, and that might be possible to assimilate somehow. As I mentioned several times, we're very interested in the atmospheric winds, and it'd be possible to compare the way we can try to verify if our winds are good is to some extent. You can assimilate observations from different spacecraft in independent kind of separate experiments and then try and compare how similar they are. And if they're similar, then that gives you a reasonable confidence that you're retrieving the real wind structure. And then finally, the diurnal cycle. We're interested in how atmospheric processes behave at local times that have not been observed before. So that's what I'm working on, and this is a summary. So what I will do is I will leave that summary up there for people to read and take any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Roland.
Dimitra, can I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah.
So Roland, compared to GCM that one uses for the Earth, what's the level of sophistication that these numerical models have for Mars?
So there's
especially, let's say, what's the importance of clouds and things like that?
So in terms of sophistication, when we build some numerical simulations for other planets, we really have to make sure that we don't go beyond what the observations let us, right? And so the main difference between Earth and Mars in terms of our understanding is that for every one observation on Mars, we have 10,000 observations on Earth. So typically in these numerical models, we try to include as many processes as possible and that we understand the basic physics of. But no, there will not be the level of sophistication that we have in Earth, some of these Earth GCMs where you might have a whole set of different types of, say, convection model or cloud model or surface vegetation model. And you might have, for example, if you have a PhD student, they might study one aspect of the GCM for 3 years and write their PhD thesis. For these simulations of other planets, with Mars, we're getting to the point where we actually do have quite sophisticated simulations, and we can produce reasonably good climate data sets that describe the climate and agree pretty well with observations. For some of the other planets, Venus, giant planets, the models we have are the physics that we put in, the physical processes are necessarily simpler because we don't have enough observations to justify making them more complicated. And I think that's a good thing. You don't want to make claims about physical processes that we just can't observe yet.
And this brings me to my next question, which is probably more important. There are many labs in which people study, let's say, different aspects of Earth's atmosphere or oceans. Physical oceanography lab, for instance, typically, let's say. What kind of lab would one have to construct in order to, let's say, understand the physical processes that are happening on Mars? How would it be different from that you create for the Earth? You know what I'm asking?
Kind of by lab, do you mean? Do you mean a laboratory a laboratory with instruments, or do you mean a set of people who are studying something?
No, laboratory with instruments and devices and let's say rotating tables or
so we can build. I have to say that there are not many labs of that type that exist anymore. Most labs that work in this area are labs that work with numerical models and with spacecraft. However, there are a couple. I mean, there are, of course, there are labs where people design and build instruments to go on spacecraft, and of course there are many people who do that. There are labs where trying to think exactly what I'm trying to think back to the last place where we actually had a real lab. So yes, there are some labs where we can build experiments using these rotating tank experiments, and those rotating tanks are used to reproduce certain aspects of the certain physical processes that are occurring in these atmospheres.
Yes.
And we use them to kind of understand the large scale behavior or some particular process in a very idealized way.
Yes.
So I showed a video of. I'm happy to talk about this for ages. This is what I did my PhD on. Actually, I studied one of these experiments. Where is it? It's right all the way back here.
That one, for instance.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah.
So this one is this is called a rotating annulus experiment, and it's a lab experiment that it's quite a small experiment. Actually, I haven't seen this one, so this one might not be quite small, but typically they're small, and an experiment like this basically reproduces the three physical processes that are most important in determining how a planet's atmosphere behaves on a large scale, on a global scale.
Yeah.
So it will rotate. You can't see that in the image, but it rotates. It has a gravitational pull, of course. And the third one is that it will have a temperature gradient across the fluid. So in this particular case, what will typically happen is that this inner cylinder will be a cold structure, and then this outer cylinder will be a warm structure, and then the whole thing is rotating. And so what that reproduces is, if you think of the Earth, for example, or some other planet, some other terrestrial planet, then it will have a gravity acts to pull the atmosphere towards the center of the Earth. The planet is rotating, and there is a temperature gradient in latitude. So you can think of a planet's atmosphere, which is on a sphere, of course, being deformed into a cylinder, and this is not actually a bad approximation. And then you can think of this outer cylinder as a low latitudes where it's warm, and the inner cylinder as the higher latitudes where it's cold. And then you run the experiment, and you find that it actually reproduces quite a lot of the large-scale behavior that you see in planetary atmospheres. I haven't shown a picture here because it wasn't the point of the talk, but there's a nice comparison you can make. If you go to the, for example, if you look at the ECMWF daily weather maps, you can see really quite clear large-scale waves that kind of look like what you find in the experiments.
Yeah, thank you.
This is a very basic one, but there are many more kind of there are many more focused ones that look at particular physical processes.
All right. Yeah, please use the Q&A feature or raise your hand, and I can unmute you to ask a question. So Roland, you mentioned that you're going to do this data simulation. How long do you think it would take for an observation to appear from actually measuring something to it appear in the Mars climate database, MCD?
Oh, in the Mars climate, do you specifically mean the Mars climate database as in the one that LMD uses?
Yeah,
or a generic Mars climate database?
The generic in the public domain.
So there is a database that is maintained by Laboratoire de Météorologie Dynamique, and it's based on numerical simulations of Mars's atmosphere, and it's called the Mars Climate Database. And if you just search for Mars Climate Database, you can find it, and you can find a web applet that will allow you to access that data. And so at the present time, this is built only using numerical simulations. Now, the numerical simulations are tuned using observations, and there is some observational information that goes into those numerical simulations, but fundamentally it's a numerical simulation. But yes, for some time they have been interested in using, in actually not replacing, but including assimilated model states in the climate database itself. This will require quite a lot of work. It's something that we've talked about over the last couple of years, and with a very good data assimilation setup, then it's something, yes, that's something that could be possible. One thing about the climate database is that when the data they use to generate it from the model runs, that those model runs are usually done for many, many years, because they want to build up they need to build up a long time series of statistics to describe the variability in the atmosphere over years. And so that's of course not possible with for example, 1 year of observations. That you can't do that. But yes, we do have, in principle, we now have a long series of data, long observational data sets. That the earliest ones go back to 2000 and maybe around 2001. So yeah, we have 20 years worth of data, 20 Earth years worth of data. So you can imagine that an assimilation product that assimilates everything from the start of the Mars, the start of the time where we started to systematically observe the Martian atmosphere. Yeah, that could in principle be included in this Mars climate database. There are some groups that have produced data sets that use this data assimilation to combine observations. And there are 3 publicly available data sets that people can download and use as they like, that combine models with observations, but not with EMM, not yet.
Okay, cool, thanks. Yeah, we have quite a few questions. So a question from Matas, where do you currently run your simulations?
So we run our simulations on the UAE University high performance computing cluster, which is a medium-sized cluster of, well, we can't use it all at once, right? But the cluster itself is about 2,000 cores, and a climate model like this, you would run, in practice, the way that we run this is we actually run each model on one processor, and we run multiple simulations. And actually that's a more useful way, that's a better approach to this particular problem than running a simulation on many, many cores. For other planets, for example, I've worked with a model of Jupiter's atmosphere where we would run it on 256 or 512 cores on on a national level facility. Unfortunately, at the moment, the UAE does not have a national level supercomputing facility, as far as I know.
Okay, cool. There is a question from Bob Johnson. What is the most critical aspect of the lower atmosphere that is not yet understood that EMM will address?
Well, from my point of view, it's lack of knowledge about the diurnal cycle. So how the atmospheric structure and atmospheric behavior varies over the course of the day, because we have not observed that. We have observed the full diurnal cycle using one spacecraft in the past, and it's not been observed systematically. So it'll be the ability to observe all local times over a short period and build a very, very large database that contains information about the lower atmosphere at all the different local times of day.
Cool. Yeah, there's one very interesting question from Muhammad Abbas. I wanted to ask it, but it slipped my mind. So the question is, can you give us a brief overview about previous detections of methane on Mars's atmosphere?
Okay, this is a whole other talk. What is? I'm going to see if I can find. There is a very nice picture that I might see if I can find. Okay, so there have been several detections and claimed detections of methane. There are probably others before this, but the earliest one that I can remember is from 2003, and this was a detection from using telescopes on Earth that claimed to detect quite a high abundance of methane. But these observations people were very critical of they were kind of incredulous about them to some extent. So that work was redone and it was re-released in 2009, I believe, and essentially with similar conclusions. So since then, yeah, it's been quite a big goal to look for methane on Mars. So the two most sensitive instruments that have tried to detect methane are the Curiosity rover. There's an instrument on Curiosity that has been taking measurements of methane concentration since the beginning of the mission, 2012. And then there's the ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter. And both of these are really highly sensitive, and they have come to opposite conclusions. The ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter has not been able to detect any methane at any time, and has a very, very low upper bound of 50 parts per trillion or something like that. It's a very, very low bound on how much methane they detect, which means that if there was methane present in less than that quantity, they would not be able to detect. So, however, Curiosity has observed and claimed to have detected methane at a kind of low background level over the course of its mission, and it's recently in the last couple of years they published some work that showed that the detection had a seasonal cycle, so it varied over the course of the season. If I'm clever and fast, I will be able to find a picture. Yeah, here we go. Let's find this one. Oh, here we go. So this is yeah. So this is a methane abundance measured by Curiosity in parts per billion by volume. So this is a tiny, tiny amount as a function of time of year, and they found a seasonal cycle. So and the variation over the course of the year that's larger than the error bars on any of the measurements. So this is an open question because the later mission, the Trace Gas Orbiter, has not been able to confirm these observations, and so they're actually waiting for a point at which there are a couple of points, a couple of days in the next year or couple of years where the orbiter will fly directly over the rover, and then they're going to try and make measurements at the same time. And hopefully then they will then agree. But it's possible that they won't. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
There was a second.
So these are results. Yeah, these are results from the ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter. At the top here are concentrations over the course of 1 year made by Curiosity, and then the ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter observations are here. And this is a log scale on the left. So this is a factor of 10 in the methane concentration. And all of these you will see are arrows pointing downwards, which means that they are upper limits. They're not detections. They're just, their detection value is 0, but with an error bar of that amount.
Right. Okay, yeah, there is another question from Muhammad Abbas. Will HOPE be able to study anything in regard to the moons of Mars, since it will be much further away from Mars compared to other?
Good question. I don't know. It's not a primary target of the orbiter. Let's just find that picture again. Showed the. There we go. Yeah. So yeah, you can see that it's outside the orbit of both the moons. I don't know. If you gave me half an hour, I could probably work out whether it would be able to take good pictures of it. I'd have to look at how good the camera is, and how big the moons are. The moons are tiny. The moons are only several kilometers across, so they are pretty small, and it's quite a long way away from the planet. So I don't believe it's a target. I don't believe it's a target, and it might not have good enough resolution in any case. But we'll see. It could be there for several years. So yeah, and it's certainly higher up than any of the others.
Yeah, so if there are no more questions, then let us thank Roland again.
Yeah, thank you, Roland.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was a great talk. Yeah, thank you.
Great to talk to you. Yeah, it's been good. I'm now looking at who's watching.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks,
all right.
Roland.
Thanks very much.